explosions near Tehran's international airport, suggesting a widening of the target set here, not just going after military facilities, nuclear facilities in Iran, as well as those senior Iranian officials, but also potentially widening it to strategic civilian sites in Iran as well. And what's important to note here is that while Israel did deal a pretty devastating blow in its initial round of strikes, there's a lot that they have still left relatively untouched in Iran, which suggests that there are many other targets that Israel can still go after in Iran, that it likely intends to go after. And a lot of that will also depend on whether or not there is a role for diplomacy here, as President Trump urges the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table and strike a deal, albeit clearly from a much, much weaker position. And then, of course, there's also what Israel is leaving on the table from a military perspective as it waits to see, how much further Iran will go in terms of its retaliatory strikes in Israel as well.
I mean, Alexander, with the death of those three very powerful men in Iran, and of course, the idea of diplomacy seeming to be at this moment in time fleeting at best, is there a prospect that this could be resolved diplomatically at all?
I think, to be absolutely frank, it's unclear. In the past hours, coming out of Iranian media, coming out of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, we've heard Iran say that talks with the US would be meaningless after Israel's attack. Now, President Trump has said that a meeting he believes is still on with the Iranians that was organized before the attack on Sunday, but it's unclear if that will take place.
Jeremy Diamond, Alexandra Cornwell, thank you both so much. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus is in Tel Aviv tonight. He is a former IDF spokesperson and senior fellow at FDD. Lieutenant Colonel, Israel's defense minister says that Iran has crossed, quote, red lines by attacking civilian centers. How do you expect Israel to now escalate its response, if at all? Will it go beyond military targets?
Yeah, good night to you. Good morning from Israel. I think Jeremy said it very succinctly. Israel has a very substantial target base of national infrastructure, regime targets, economic infrastructure, and many others that it has, by decision, not yet exploited, not yet targeted. And I think, the bottom line is phone calls between Washington and Jerusalem. Whether or not Israel will escalate and expand that, I think Israel wants to. My guess is that currently Israel is waiting for green light and approval from the US in order to do exactly that. And as many times in the Middle East, the number of casualties in Israel will be the deciding factor how Israel evolves its campaign against Iran.
Well, speaking of the United States and the President of the United States, President Trump, he says that the U.S. was aware of Israel's plans to attack, and the U.S. did help Israel shoot down Iranian missiles. Does Israel need America's assistance in order to keep its attacks on Iran going and also to defend itself?
I'd say yes on both answers. Specifically, most importantly, the provision of munitions and interceptors. Those are two resources that are critical for Israel. And yes, I think it's widely known that Israel relies on the supply of them from the United States. So therefore, coordination and seeing things eye to eye and having the approval of the American administration is very important for defending Israelis in these attacks that we see on the screen. Most of them civilian. I know of also of military targets that have been hit, but most of the casualties in Israel today are civilian. And I think coordination here is key.
We are hearing from Israeli sources that say that they took part in a deception operation to trick Iran into believing there would not be a strike. Did that play a big role in the ability of Israel to even pull this off?
Judging by the results, I think obviously the Iranians were deceived or were tricked into believing that they're safe and that there was no imminent Israeli strike. There was lots of talks here on CNN and many other places, Israeli media, about what Israel was doing. But I think in general that the Iranians thought that as long as negotiations are ongoing, they're safe and they can continue to waste time, and they can continue to use negotiations as a shield from an Israeli attack. I wouldn't say that the Americans deceived. Israel probably did so, and deception is part of warfare. That's one of the basic principles. If you can cause your enemy to believe other than reality, and then that's a good thing. Sadly, our enemies do it, and they do it well. And bottom line, I think the opening salvo, you mentioned three important Iranian officials. We're talking about, as far as I know, more than 20 senior officers, 3- and 4-star generals, and very important nuclear scientists that were eliminated in that first salvo more than almost 24 hours ago now.
Jonathan Conriquez, thank you so much for joining us. With me now, retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Steve Anderson, and also Jamil Jaffer, former counsel to the Assistant AG for National Security. Jamil, I want to go to you first and get your assessment of Iran's counterstrikes on Israel. I mean, were they weakened at all by Israel's attacks? Is it fundamentally evident?
Well, look, you know, the last time we saw Iran go after Israel after the first set of attacks, they launched hundreds of drones, hundreds of ballistic missiles. This time, we had 100 drones last night, a few dozen missiles this time. They were able to impact Israel. They were able to land some missiles on target. The vast majority, like every time, shot down by a combination of Iron Dome, David Sling, the Arrow 2, and of course, now American THAAD and Patriot missiles as well.
Let me ask you about this, what is perceived as a threat, frankly, around the world, heard from Iran. They're warning that countries that defend Israel could face attacks on their military bases and also, of course, in the region. Is that a direct threat that you would interpret to the United States? Is the military going to be, are they thinking already about a response?
Absolutely, Laura. No doubt they're on high alert. I mean, we got 47,000 Americans in uniform in 9 different countries in the Middle East. Al Udeid Air Base, Bahrain Naval Base, a lot of troops at risk over there. No doubt that they are preparing for something to happen. And if that were to happen, that would definitely be a trigger. I mean, you'd see the United States, I think, get involved. But until then, I think that they're going to stay on the sidelines and let the Israelis handle this right now. But it's going to be a very big problem.
You know, when you think about this, Jamel, and we've already learned, of course, several top Iranian military leaders were killed. We know that their nuclear facilities, they've also been hit. But there's still this question of whether Israel can destroy the nuclear facilities that are actually deep underground. Does Israel have that capability?
Well, look, Israel only has a certain amount of bunker busters that can go to a certain depth. They've got the Spice 2000, which is a 2,000-pound bomb. What they don't have is the U.S. massive ordnance penetrator delivered on the B-2 Spirit. That's the thing you need to get those really deep facilities. And getting Natanz, the deeply buried, the new facilities after 2022 at Natanz, and Fordo, which is a key enrichment facility, the Iranians have buried it deep enough that it's very hard to get those. So if the Israelis are going to go after those, they have to do it with forces on the ground. We've already heard about Mossad operations in Iran over the course of this last set of strikes. We'll see if they pull it off, but it's going to be very hard without U.S. weapons and U.S. delivery vehicles of the B-2 Spirit.
General, it sounds like they need to have the United States buy in and support.
Absolutely. I mean, we used to call it the mother of all bombs when we were in Iraq. We had 3 of them over there. They're incredibly capable. They can penetrate much, much deeper. As Jamil says, you know, we've got to get those. If you're going to take out those nuclear facilities in Fordo that are dug in and deep, you're going to need the United States to be participating in this attack.
Well, that begs the question. I mean, the U.S. is saying, President Trump telling Reuters that we knew everything about the strikes. Knowing about the strikes and knowing that they might have to be called upon in order to participate somehow to get to those underground sites puts the United States military and the United States in a pretty compromised position then.
I absolutely agree with that. It would be a problem for us to get involved in this too early. So we probably need some kind of a trigger, some attack that would give us, I think, the excuse to really take sides. Right now, Israel is being able to handle this. They executed an incredible attack, brazen attack that was incredibly successful. They do not need the United States to get involved at this point. But if the Iranians expand this war, somehow escalate this, and they attack any American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines that are exposed, or any American facilities, we definitely need to get on board with the Israelis, and we need to take down the nuclear capability of Iran immediately.
We're looking at live pictures right now of central Israel. Fresh damage from an Iranian strike that has happened just moments ago. We're seeing the results of that right now. And Jamil, I want to go to you on this because Netanyahu has said that the strike was carried out now because they suspected that Iran was close to being able to actually build these nuclear bombs. That seems to be at odds, though, with the U.S. intelligence assessments that we are aware of. So are there other reasons that might be at play for why now?
Well, a couple of things. One, in order to use a nuclear weapon, you need three things. You need the enriching uranium, you need a valid weapons design, you need a ballistic missile delivery system. What Netanyahu has said was he believed they're moving towards weaponization. That's a new statement. We'll see if that's true. Beyond that, we've seen the Trump administration go in a couple of different directions. We saw early on Steve Witkoff say it's fine if they enrich. The president walked it back. Then the president gave a little bit. Witkoff walked it back. Rubio's been consistent in saying no enrichment. That might have scared the Israelis to say if the Trump administration might get into a deal with Iran that allows enrichment, that's unacceptable. That's probably what drove them to ultimately say, we're going to take these strikes. You want us to do it or not? We're doing it.
I want to go right now because we have some video that's playing of what the damage has been from this new strike in central Israel. We're obviously seeing damage to buildings and different structures as we see different first responders who are arriving on the scene, walking over various debris with identifiable jackets. We are looking to see the assessment of whether civilians have been harmed. Obviously, we are seeing cars that appear to be severely damaged and buildings or structures of some kind that clearly are compromised in these early morning hours, dawn really just breaking in Israel. You know, General, when you're looking at this, and of course, the United States military is obviously watching this. So are other military bases and allies, perhaps around the world as well. When you see this damage and the knowledge that the White House is saying that they had about the strikes, is Iran looking at this as everyone being complicit and therefore they feel as though they have been attacked and we are risking a potential war with ourselves as well?
That's probably the case. I mean, they probably feel that they've been, the noose has been tightened. I mean, if you look at what the Israelis have done over the last 18 months, they've taken down Hamas, they've taken down Hezbollah, the Palestinians have been laid down quite a bit, Syria has collapsed. I mean, the world, the Houthis have been hit hard by the Americans down south in Yemen. I mean, the world, the proxies that supported Iran over the last couple of decades, they have been decimated, really. And so the noose is closing on Iran. So they are getting desperate. And that's why I think you're seeing these attacks on civilian targets, is because that's really the only thing they can hit right now. They don't have the capability. They mask their missile attacks to try to get a few through. And when they do, they're hitting civilian targets. And it's very much the similar playbook that the Russians are using against the Ukrainians, by the way. They're trying to just essentially wreak havoc among the civilian population and take the hurt to the people.
Really quickly, does that desperation lead to diplomacy or rash decisions?
Well, I hope it's the former and not the latter. Hopefully that they are going to realize, hey, listen, we cannot win this war with Israel. They are better than us. They're smarter than us. They have complete intelligence dominance. They have air dominance, as you saw by a 1,000-mile strike deep into the heart of Tehran, in which you were able to hit targets. So they realize they are not going to win this in a tit-for-tat exchange. They've got to achieve some kind of a diplomatic solution. They're not going to win any other way.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. General Steve Anderson, Jamil Jaffer. We have much more ahead on this breaking news. Benjamin Netanyahu delivering a message directly to the Iranian people, raising questions about his endgame here. Plus, how is President Trump handling all this tonight, and how will he respond to the blowback from some of his supporters? Now, as we continue to monitor the situation in the Middle East, one of the big questions is how President Trump is going to handle having a conflict spill out on his watch. Today, he reaffirmed the United States' support for Israel, telling our own Dana Bash the strikes on Iran were, quote, a very successful attack. He also told Reuters he saw this coming, saying, quote, we knew everything, and I tried to save Iran humiliation and death. I want to bring in White House correspondent for Reuters, Jeff Mason, and Josh Rogan's also here, the lead global security analyst for Washington Post Intelligence. Jeff, just weeks ago, Trump urged Netanyahu to hold off on these attacks to avoid jeopardizing negotiations and diplomacy with Iran. He seemed to strike a very different tone today, though. What more can you tell us about the administration's response to all of this tonight?
Well, I think the focus, if you're looking at the administration's response, is to focus on President Trump, as you rightly started with, Laura. And yes, he is supporting the strikes and said that that they were successful. But it is a contrast to what he's been telling reporters, including myself, for weeks, that the talks with Iran were going well. And there's a lot on the line for him politically as a result. He has portrayed himself as a president of peace. And despite that portrayal, and despite legitimate attempts by the administration to reach a deal with Iran, that did not stop Israel from this attack.
Well taken as a point, Josh, because it sounded like Trump wanted diplomacy to run its course, but Netanyahu went ahead with the strikes. And so why do you think Trump was unable to prevent Netanyahu from doing this? Even though he says he was aware of it, that's not the same thing as being approving of it.
Right. Well, to take Trump at face value, he seems to be saying that he thinks the strikes will encourage Iran to come back to the negotiating table. And if that's true, then that seems incredibly naive, for the simple reason that Israel just killed the negotiators, and killing the negotiators tends to dampen the negotiations. And anyone who's left alive in the Iranian system is very busy right now with things more important to them than meeting Steve Witkoff in Oman. So if that was Trump's thinking, and that's what he says, that he greenlighted the strikes to get Iran to rethink its negotiating strategy, to be more amenable to negotiation, well, I don't think that's going to work out the way that Trump wants. And if Trump is not being honest, which is totally possible, then I don't really see how his claim that Iran will come back to the table makes any sense or is useful in any way. So it seems like Trump was convinced to greenlight the strikes. The Israelis didn't defy Trump; they convinced him somehow. But I don't think it's going to work out the way he says it's going to work out.
We'll have to see what the ultimate conversation really was. But Jeff, some prominent figures in the MAGA camp, they're not happy. Tucker Carlson said that Trump is, quote, complicit in the act of war. It's a quote. And that America should drop Israel, let them fight their own wars. Is there a divide in the party at the White House is now worried about, particularly having figures like Carlson and others voice these concerns?
Well, there's certainly a divide, and it's fascinating to see MAGA Inc., the very core of MAGA, coming out and criticizing the president and separating themselves from him. It takes a lot for that to happen, Laura. There have been a few cracks in that armor over the last several months. There was some disappointment by MAGA world over not seeing more in the Jeffrey Epstein files, for example. But you certainly haven't seen any kind of major criticism from that world. So seeing that now, yeah, I'm sure that is concerning to the White House and to the president. The question is, what does he do about it? Because it puts him in a bind. He has certainly been very, very supportive, robustly supportive of Israel. And to change that position would be a massive, massive shift for him. But to compare, which isn't, obviously there aren't many opportunities to compare him with President Biden. President Biden also had problems with his base because of his support for Israel and never really recovered from the left's disappointment in that support because of Israel's what it was doing in Gaza.
Josh, what do you make of the critique that Trump is ignoring his whole America First principle?
Right. Well, I think it just reinforces the idea, which I'm sympathetic to, that President Trump has no core principles, that he's liable to change his opinions and his views on any issue on any day based on whoever he talks to that day or whatever he thinks his calculation or interests are that day. And so what the MAGA people have been doing is they've been trying to purge the pro-Israel people inside the administration, starting with Mike Waltz, but all the way down the line. And their theory was if less people talk to Trump about helping Israel, then maybe Trump won't be convinced to help Israel attack Iran. But it doesn't seem to have worked out that way because Trump will do what Trump will do. So I just think this endless battle inside the administration, the fratricide, the purges, all of this sort of attacks back and forth are going to go on forever, but nobody ever really wins because Trump gets a phone call the next day and then he just does something completely different because in his own soul, there's probably not a lot of strategery going on. It's just sort of, what do I do today?
Well, we'll see what phone call comes up next and what the diplomacy is on the other end of the call. Jeff, Mason, Josh, Rogan, thank you both so much. Israel's attack on Iran, years in the making, but why now? And how exactly does Benjamin Netanyahu plan to see this out? That's next. Of southern Israel, CNN's Nick Robertson found a smoldering projectile while driving to Tel Aviv. Here's his report.
Look at this rocket behind me here. This just came down. We were watching intercepts in the sky above me, the early morning sky, and there was a lot of loud explosions and impacts. And you can see here, this missile here, right behind me, lying in the road here. It's still smoking. This came down. This was from the latest salvo of Iranian missiles intercepted. Not clear if this is an intercept missile or one of the Iranian missiles. Still smoking in the road here. Only just came down.
Unbelievable. Again, that was Nick Robertson on his way to Tel Aviv, coming across that. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Iranian people directly today.
The objective of Israel's military operation is to remove this threat, both the nuclear threat and the ballistic missile threat to Israel. And as we achieve our objectives, we're also clearing the path for you to achieve your objective, which is freedom.
Joining me now is Aaron David Miller, former State Department Middle East negotiator and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Bobby Ghosh. He's a geopolitics analyst and the former editor of Hindustan Times. Thank you both. Bobby, let me begin with you because he called for Iranians to stand up for their freedom. What did you make of that appeal from Netanyahu?
Well, he's done this before. On several occasions, he's spoken directly to Iranian people. It's got no traction within Iran, as far as I can tell. Nobody I've spoken to there takes it very seriously. Regardless of what they think about their regime, Iranians do not appreciate Netanyahu's attempts to start essentially a conflict with Iran. He's a very, very unpopular figure. He's a figure of fun and occasionally a kind of hoodoo figure. So it's a little hard to tell what he thinks he's going to achieve by addressing Iran in that way. Perhaps it's his idea of showing to a larger Western audience or international audience that he's a reasonable man and that he has the Iranian people's best interests at heart. But I don't think anybody in Tehran or across the Iranian population is buying that for a minute.
Let's talk about regime change, Aaron, because there is some speculation, of course, that Netanyahu's endgame is to bring about regime change. You've seen very, very skeptical about this, that it's possible. Why?
I mean, in many respects, it's the prime minister's default position, Lauren. If you look at Gaza, 18 months in right now, and the prime minister has pledged total victory. Total victory in Gaza means not only the decimation of Hamas as a military organization, but the end of its political influence in Gaza. And I fear trying to get out of this is going to be extremely difficult for the Israelis because I don't think they'll be able to demonstrate that they've either destroyed Iran's nuclear program on one hand, and if they're interested in regime change, which I think is reflected in the prime minister's address to the Iranian people, it is a call basically to overthrow the government. Repressive authoritarian government, understandable. But I think what Netanyahu is doing, and if Gaza is a precedent, this is going to go on for quite some time because total victory, the end of Iran's nuclear program and possible weaponization, and the overthrow of the regime, I think both of those are frankly unachievable goals by the Israelis.
Bobby, President Trump is still telling Iran to make a deal. Do you think any of this pressures them in any way to come to the negotiating table to engage, dare I say, re-engage in diplomacy?
No, not anytime soon. If anything, it has pushed things back several steps. Right now, while the country is at war with Iran, I cannot see any Iranian leader, current or immediate future Iranian leader, making that kind of a call and agreeing to a negotiated peace with Israel or a negotiated end to its nuclear program. On the contrary, if anything, there will be a lot of hardline voices in Iran who make the contrary argument, saying that this is proof that we need a nuclear weapons program and that we need to ramp up our efforts to get our hands on the bomb to prevent this kind of attack from Israel or from our enemies from taking place. So no, I don't, certainly not in the short to medium term. I can't see this working out in the way that Trump has been describing.
You know, Aaron, President Trump is trying to manage multiple international crises and is trying to negotiate peace deals, it would seem. But he's been coming up short, shall we say. And I wonder what you think the flaw in his strategy has been. Has he overestimated the willingness of the different entities to actually negotiate, or has he underestimated the tension or the long-standing history in the areas?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, Laura. Look, you can invite two of the best negotiators I know, one of whom I work for, James Baker. The other is Henry Kissinger. You can invite them back to do this thing, and they would have a difficult time. These are very heavy lifts. But in answer to your question, I think, number one, Donald Trump is discovering some very hard truths. His own vaunted negotiating skills are open to considerable argument. And you need a strategy. You need a strategy on Russia, Ukraine. You need a strategy on Israel, Hamas. You need a strategy on the US and Iran. And that strategy involves serious diplomacy and leverage, using American leverage and power, although it has limits, to move both parties in these three conflicts forward. And frankly, the president talks a big game, but in terms of discipline, leverage, applying it effectively, I think he's fallen short.
I mean, Bobby, how much sway does the U.S. even have over Israel at the moment? I mean, can Israel proceed without the United States' support?
Well, Israel has plenty of leverage with ironically, to Aaron's point, the U.S. does not have a lot of leverage over Iran. It has a lot of leverage over Israel, but is completely uninterested in using that leverage. And this is not just Trump. This also applied to the Biden administration and administrations going back several decades even, that the United States seems highly reluctant to use the leverage it does have with Israel, and it doesn't have any leverage with Israel's enemies, particularly with Iran. I think the point that Aaron was making earlier is worth repeating here, that Trump doesn't really have a strategy. He has, at best, some tactics, and these are highly fluid and they change from moment to moment. He's nothing if not mercurial. A great deal depends on what he's seen in the latest position papers, of what the latest person who's spoken to him has said to him, and he changes his mind all too often. He has not shown any inclination, and by the way, nor have the people around him, to do the long, hard graft of diplomacy. It's not enough to say that you want to be a man of peace, and nor is it enough to threaten to use the big stick that previous presidents have deployed. Bluster is not a strategy, but that is all that Trump is deploying here.
Aaron David Miller, Bobby Ghosh, thank you both so much. Still ahead tonight, how far will Iran go in retaliating? And might they have plans to go beyond Israel? That conversation is next. Celebrating their military retaliation, security analysts are warning Iran's response might not be limited to just Israel. Iran has a long history of directing terror operations abroad through the use of Hezbollah and other proxies. Remember, just last year, the DOJ unveiled an Iranian murder-for-hire plot to kill Donald Trump here in the United States. In that indictment, the DOJ warned the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran is actively targeting nationals of the United States and its allies living in countries around the world for attacks. Joining me now is Danelle Harvin. He is the former Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for Washington, D.C. Danelle, I mean, Iran's proxies have certainly been weakened in recent months. Do you think that Iran still has the capability to inspire or even direct plots here or abroad?
Absolutely, they have the ability to do both. The weakening of their proxies is really in the region that they're in. but that has nothing to do with what we call the KSTs, the known and suspected terrorists that reside not only in this country, unfortunately, but in other countries. So they have the potential and the intent, I might add, to attack if we cross a red line, and we're not quite sure what that red line is, with sleeper cells that have been implanted over the course of decades. And so that's clearly a concern. That's something that we thought about. We went through this process 5 years ago, Laura, with the assassination of General Soleimani.
Well, I wonder how the intelligence community and Homeland Security would be adjusting to the possibility of, as you say, sleeper cells or the KSTs.
Hello to our viewers joining here in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Brian Abel in Atlanta. We are following breaking news this hour. Iran and Israel trading barrages of heavy fire with neither side slowing down. In the past few minutes, we heard an Iranian rocket struck south of Tel Aviv, killing one person and leaving 23 others injured. Hours earlier, new explosions were heard over Jerusalem after officials warned a wave of missiles was headed toward Israel. And the Associated Press quoted Israel's paramedic service saying 2 people were killed when a missile hit central Israel, injuring 19 others. Meanwhile, Iranian media said fire had broken out at Tehran's Mehrabad International Airport and that several explosions were heard over the capital. Earlier, Israel said its first fatality of the conflict was a woman who was killed east of Tel Aviv. Israel's ambassador to the U.S. says more than 40 other people were injured in Israel. Those attacks were a retaliation for a wave of Israeli strikes on targets across Iran, including nuclear facilities and key military leaders. An Iranian diplomat at the UN said at least 78 people were killed in his country and more than 300 were injured. Tehran is now threatening to hit military bases of any country that's helping Israel defend itself. Israel's prime minister spells out again why he launched those attacks in the first place.
We're in the midst of one of the greatest military operations in history, Operation Rising Lion. The Islamic regime, which has oppressed you for nearly 50 years, threatens to destroy my country, the State of Israel. The objective of Israel's military operation is to remove this threat, both the nuclear threat and the ballistic missile threat to Israel.
Nada Bashir is monitoring developments from London and joins us live with the latest. Nada?
Well, it appears as though this crisis will only continue to escalate, and that is certainly the warning that we have been hearing from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And we've been hearing from Israeli sources speaking to CNN the suggestion at this stage, or indication rather, is that this isn't going to be the sort of tit-for-tat strategy that we may have seen in the past in any sort of confrontation between Israel and Iran, but rather the Israeli military and government appears to be following an escalatory strategy. And we've heard that warning, of course, from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that these attacks will continue for days until Israel is able to eliminate what it has described as the Iranian nuclear threat, which has long characterized as an existential threat to the state of Israel. But of course, what we have seen over the last few hours and overnight is the continued targeting of Israeli territory by the Iranian regime using ballistic missiles. We heard just in the last few hours from the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who has put the figure of missiles targeting Israeli territory at around 150 missiles. And what we've seen from our teams on the ground is, of course, many of them being intercepted, but several missiles making impact. And of course, we've heard from the Iranian regime saying that they have been successful in targeting military assets in the region. But again, no comment on that from the Israeli military at this stage. But of course, this comes in response to the unprecedented attack by Israel on Iran in the early hours of Friday local time. We've heard from the IDF. They said they used about 200 fighter jets to carry out that attack, dropping some 300 munitions, undisclosed munitions, on Iranian territory. And of course, we have seen hundreds injured, according to Iranian officials, more than 70 people killed among them top military officials and nuclear scientists. We've also seen nuclear facilities being targeted and damaged as a result. But what we are also seeing developing now is those continued attacks on Iranian territory, now seemingly expanding to more strategic civilian targets as well. As you mentioned, we've seen reports now of a fire breaking out in Tehran's international airport, concern there around the potential targeting of civilian infrastructure expanding as we continue, of course, to see these attacks over the coming hours, potentially over the coming days, if indeed that warning from the Israeli Prime Minister proves correct. And of course, what the fear is now is that the hope for any sort of attempts by diplomats to de-escalate these tensions are somewhat remote at this stage. This is perhaps the largest and most significant escalation that we have seen between Iran and Israel, and the fear is that we will continue to see this expanding into civilian areas as well. As you mentioned, we've already seen one person killed now in Israel as well, so real concern on both sides for the potential for this to continue to escalate.
CNN's Nada Bashir. Nada, thank you.
Those who support this regime with the United States at the forefront must understand that they are complicit by aiding and enabling these crimes, by they share full responsibility for the consequences. The United States' complicity in this terrorist attack is beyond doubt. The officials of the United States have expressly and brazenly confessed their willful aid and assistance in the crimes and gross violation that Israeli regime committed as of last night, including the deliberate transfer of arms. We will not forget that our people lost their lives as a result of the Israeli attacks with American weapons.
That was Iran's ambassador to the United Nations addressing an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on Friday. The U.S. says it was not involved in the strikes on Iran, but it is helping defend Israel from Iran's retaliatory strikes. For more on this, we are joined by CNN military analyst Cedric Leighton, who's also a retired U.S. Air Force colonel. Colonel, we just heard Iran's UN ambassador there. We've also heard from President Trump basically saying we gave Iran 60 days. Israel's attack was at day 61. What role did the U.S. play in all of this?
Well, Brian, as best as we know, the U.S. at the very least is providing defensive aid to the Israelis. And what that means is they've positioned at least one destroyer in the Eastern Mediterranean to provide the kind of radar support that an Aegis-equipped destroyer can provide as part of the air defense and missile defense system that is then connected to the Iron Dome and the other systems that the Israelis have. So in this sense, the aid that we know about from a military operational perspective is defensive in nature. Now, the question then becomes, what actually did the United States know, or at least did senior officials know, and when did they know it? That gets a little bit murky because when you look at the kinds of things that President Trump has been saying over the past week or so, it's not very clear. He seemed to not want the Israelis to go and attack Iran, probably because he wanted to see if he could get nuclear negotiations, not only started, but had to make some progress with the Iranians. So that's one part of it. But now that the Israelis have done this, it seems as if President Trump is happy to basically bask in the purported success of these strikes. And that's the kind of situation that we find ourselves in. So we don't really know exactly what he knew and when he knew it, but we have an idea that he knew something before the Israeli strikes occurred.
And likely we'll get more insight in the coming days to that. Colonel, was that first barrage of missiles from Iran tonight the climax of Iran's response to Israel's attacks? They said it would be a long night for Israel. Is that what we've seen?
Well, it's dawn, it's past dawn now in Israel and in Iran. So I don't think we've seen everything, but it'll probably another 24 to 48 hours before we see more of this kind of activity. I think the Iranians do have missiles in reserve. Their inventory was purported to be over 3,000 or so missiles that could reach Israel in one form or another. And then, of course, they have the drones, particularly the Shahed drones that have become infamous because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So the Iranians do have something in their arsenal, both in the sense of drones as well as missiles. But their ability to command and control those assets, to launch those assets, and to, in essence, conduct a synchronized attack like they were able to do in October and before that during the previous summer, that seems to be lacking. And I think that's partly the result of the way the Israelis, in essence, decapitated the Iranian hierarchy, the military hierarchy.
Let's talk about the targeting. We're seeing some of these images now. We've also seen the aftermath of the missiles that made it through the Iron Dome, at least one hitting a residential building. Is there a method to the madness here? Any specific targets, or is it more so a strategy of throwing everything up in the air and seeing what makes it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Brian. But the Iranians did have a list. It's been reported through several sources that they had a list of particular targets that they want to hit. But it's one thing to have a list, and another thing to have the actual coordinates, the accurate geographic coordinates for these particular targets. For example, the Iranians probably had places like the headquarters for the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, on their list, the headquarters of the Israeli Defense Forces, installations like that. But it seems as if, at least so far, seems as if they haven't been able to accurately target those entities. So they may have the list, they may have an idea of what they want to hit, but they may not be able to accurately hit these targets with the precision that would be necessary to take them out. On the other hand, the Israelis have been very precise in a lot of the targeting that they've done in this part of the operation. So there's a big difference in the way they are doing it. So far, the Iranian side is more or less throwing their assets basically in any way that they can toward Israel. The Israeli side is taking a more precise approach because they've basically planned this operation for a long time.
Certainly a contrast of capabilities. Colonel, if you were orchestrating the next moments for either of these countries, how would you be strategizing? What objectives would you be hoping to achieve, and how would you get there? I guess what I'm asking is, what can we expect to happen next?
Yeah, so if I were on the Israeli side, I'd be looking at, what kinds of Iranian targets are still operational after the first several salvos of attacks that have been conducted so far. So are the nuclear facilities still operational? What parts of the nuclear facilities should I hit, and which ones can I hit, and what kind of damage can I actually inflict on them? We know that at least one of those nuclear facilities is a deeply buried one, the Fordo site. The Natanz site has been hit. It may have been disabled to a fairly critical extent because of a strike that purportedly hit the power source for the area where the centrifuges are located. So that could be a significant thing. So if that's already hit, I wouldn't be going after that, at least not immediately, because it's already been damaged to the extent that I need it to be damaged. So that's the kind of thing I would do if I were on the Israeli side. If I were on the Iranian side, I would want to orchestrate something where I would basically sequence both the missile attacks and the drone attacks so that they would hit at a time and place that would make it difficult for the Israeli missile defense systems like the Iron Dome to respond to those attacks. In essence, I would try to overwhelm those systems. Whether or not the Iranians can do that, of course, is a question. We know they want to do that, but their ability to do that may have been damaged at this point.
Colonel, I know you've been with us throughout this counterattack overnight in Tel Aviv. Appreciate your expertise as always. Colonel Cedric Layton, thank you.
You bet, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu spoke on the phone on Friday. The U.S. says it was not part of the attack on Iran, but questions remain over how much the U.S. administration actually knew before Israel's strikes. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more from the White House.
Much of Friday was trying to figure out what the United States knew, what the administration knew, and when, because of that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State statement that we had seen on Thursday that really clearly laid out this was a unilateral decision for Israel to strike Iran. The United States had nothing to do with it, also saying that U.S. personnel should not be attacked in any way because, again, they were not involved. However, we did start to learn some details on Friday that signified that that wasn't entirely accurate. One was that Donald Trump, we learned, had multiple phone calls with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, including before those strikes. At one point, Donald Trump told reporters he knew everything about what was happening. And now the question is, what exactly are they going to do next? Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump spoke again on Friday. No details yet, no readout of that call, but we did learn that U.S. officials say that the United States is helping deter missiles that are coming into Israel now as a response from Iran. And that official said that this is because there are tens of thousands of American citizens that are in Israel. They also said there's a lot of U.S. military assets. So clearly here, trying to say this is because they want to protect Americans. This is not necessarily because this is not a unilateral decision, but it's a little bit of splitting hairs here to say that they're not involved. The United States is not involved in any of this, but they are protecting Israel. Now, of course, the big question the administration is working on is whether or not they can still get Iran to the table in the Iranian nuclear deal talks. They were supposed to have the sixth round of talks on Sunday in Oman. Middle Eastern and envoy Steve Witkoff was going to be present with Iranians. It is unclear if that's going to still happen. The administration says they still want to bring Iran to the table. They still think that they might show up. And Donald Trump, for his part, has really been trying to push the Iranians on this, essentially saying, it could be too late. Look at what's already happened. I gave you a lot of chances. Now Israel has bombed you. You better show up to the table. Kind of giving a loose threat that things could be worse if they don't make a deal. Some administration officials have cast doubt on the idea that Iran is going to show up at all given these strikes, but there are still a lot within the White House in particular that believe that this could still happen even as early as Sunday. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
Israel's spy agency is revealing rare footage of its secret operation inside Iran before it launched the military strikes there. The sounds of loud booms heard in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem earlier as Iran launched what it describes as hundreds of ballistic missiles in response to Israel's military strikes against its nuclear program on Friday. Iran's envoy to the United Nations says the Israeli strikes had killed at least 78 people and injured more than 320. CNN's Clarissa Ward has more from her vantage point on the ground in Israel.
We had been anticipating that there might be some kind of a strike on Iran for days now, but I don't think anyone imagined anything like the scale, the breadth of this. As you're well aware, the airspace over Israel is closed. The airspace over Jordan is closed. We actually had to fly to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt and cross the border that way. And as we were driving towards the border, we could see the sky lighting up in the distance as those interceptors were intercepting those Iranian missiles. We have heard a lot of fighter jets also over in the skies. We heard a drone recently up in the sky. So a fair amount of activity going on here. And it's interesting, we've only been on the ground for less than an hour, but when you talk to Israelis, they really feel it's different too. And while, depending on who you talk to, there's an element of pride at the kind of military and intelligence prowess that Israel has showed with this operation against Iran, there is also a great deal of anxiety because everyone senses that this is different to last summer when you had that tit for tat between Iran and Israel. This is different than when the Houthis in Yemen were attacking, when Hezbollah, when Hamas even were attacking. This feels very real, and particularly with those landfalls taking place in Tel Aviv, in areas around Tel Aviv, inhabited civilian areas. There is absolutely a charged sense of anxiety here. And I should say, not just here, across the entire region, as everybody is kind of girding themselves or bracing themselves for further escalation with no real clear off-ramp on the table at the moment for either side.
Israel's spy agency, Mossad, has unveiled some of the sophisticated intelligence operation behind its military strikes against Iran. Mossad shared video with CNN that shows Israeli operatives smuggling weapons into Iran before Friday's strikes. And an Israeli security official told CNN how they created a base inside Iran to launch explosive drones there. CNN's Matthew Chance has more.
Behind the unprecedented Israeli strikes across Iran, a sophisticated intelligence operation, with Mossad releasing these rare images of what it says are its covert operations deep inside enemy territory. In this video, 2 masked operatives can be seen crouching down, adjusting equipment. One Israeli security official told CNN Mossad established a drone base in Iran ahead of the strikes to target the Islamic Republic from within. This video appears to show a drone targeting a missile launcher. Another shows the crosshairs of a drone over a target which appears to be a truck. Israeli officials say precision weapons were smuggled into central Iran and positioned near missile systems. There are striking similarities with the Ukrainian attacks deep inside Russia earlier this month, where spectacular covert drone strikes destroyed valuable Russian strategic bombers. But alongside the Israeli hits on Iranian military and nuclear targets, key leadership figures were also targeted and killed in pinpoint strikes, likely driven by highly accurate Israeli intelligence, including top commanders of the powerful Revolutionary Guard Corps and multiple nuclear scientists, according to Iranian officials. But the ongoing Israeli campaign is high risk, already provoking serious retaliation across Israel, including on Tel Aviv. And the escalating conflict could also bolster hardline Iranian calls for a nuclear deterrent, meaning this stunning Israeli intelligence coup may actually increase the nuclear threat it was meant to remove. Matthew Chance, CNN London.
Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. And he joins us now from Washington. Trita, let's talk a little about that word in your book title there, diplomacy. It seems that President Trump still believes there's a path to it, at least on the nuclear front, even after the events of the last 48 hours. What do you think?
There certainly is a path. The problem is that Trump entered these talks, in fact, created the circumstances that allowed these talks by adopting a very reasonable starting point and red lines, which is no weaponization. But then a couple of weeks ago, he shifted to a completely different red line, no enrichment at all, essentially meaning that the entire nuclear program had to be eliminated. And we've already tried that for 20 years. It doesn't work. And quite predictably, it led to a stalemate in the talks, which then the Israelis took advantage of to convince him to allow them to do these attacks. There is a pathway back to the table, and that is for Trump to go back to his original, much more reasonable and workable and realistic red line. And if that happens, perhaps there can be an exit out of this, because as we have now seen from the Iranian retaliation, this seems to end up being a rather messy situation rather than this clean-cut victory for the Israelis that many expected it to be after the initial attack by Israel.
Well, aside from President Trump's potential moves that would need to happen, what other steps would need to happen now for the rockets to stop moving in either direction?
Well, if the Trump administration puts pressure on Israel to stop, I think it will be easy to get the Iranians to stop as well and go back to the table. But as long as Trump has adopted this position that he's essentially allowing, while also supporting what the Israelis are doing, there's no reason to believe that the Israelis would stop. We've already had experience with that, in which the Israelis have done whatever they wanted in Gaza because we have provided them with that impunity.
We heard Netanyahu pitch to Iranians to stand up to the Iranian regime. Is that the end game for Israel here, you think, for an uprising, maybe a regime change?
I think more than anything else, perhaps a regime collapse, in which they're not really trying to change the regime to something else, meaning that they would be championing some sort of alternative, because that would mean that they would own whatever comes afterwards, as the U.S. owned what happened in Iraq, and that was a disaster. But regime collapse means that you just create chaos in the country and there's no regime there at all. So I think that potentially is something that they're looking for. But the idea that this would end up being supported by the Iranian public, I'm sure there's a segment of the public because of their tremendous and justified anger against the regime. But we have so far seen that the overwhelming reaction is the kind of rallying around the flag that tends to happen in any country when they're attacking.
Trita, does this stay a conflict between Israel and Iran, or does it spread?
Well, there is a significant risk that this could spread. And one way that it could do so is that if this continues and the Iranians strike back and they're successful as they appear to have been, and this gets into a messy situation, a lot of casualties, Trump may grow tired of this. We've seen him do that before with Yemen and then just pull out. Or he may be under so much pressure to step in to help the Israelis that he enters the war and brings America into the war fully. In that scenario, the Iranians will likely strike at the U.S. itself, meaning at American bases in the region. And that would then regionalize the war. It wouldn't just be a U.S.-Iran war, which in and of itself, I think, would be a disaster, but it would also be a regional war.
Trita Parsi in Reston, Virginia. Trita, appreciate your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Israel dealt a major blow to Iran's nuclear program and its military leadership. When we return, more on which nuclear sites were hit and who was targeted. Eyes are on the Middle East right now as Israel and Iran ramp up attacks on each other. Iran says its missile strikes targeted Israeli military centers and air bases Friday. Police say at least one woman was killed when an Iranian missile hit near a group of homes. Iran's supreme leader issuing this warning to Israel.
Life will become bitter for them, without a doubt. They should not think they struck and it's over. No, they started this and triggered a war. We will not allow them to walk away unscathed from the great crime they have committed.
Iran's retaliation came swiftly after Israel targeted its nuclear and military sites. The country's UN envoy says Israeli strikes have killed at least 78 people, including some of Iran's most senior leaders. The Israeli ambassador to the UN explains why Israel decided to launch these attacks now.
The goals of our operation are very clear. It is to make sure that Iran will not have nuclear capabilities and to stop the ballistic missile operation. And I will elaborate on that. You know, they producing hundreds of missiles. They wanted to get to a position where they can compete with Russia and the US regarding ballistic missiles. So we want to stop both the ballistic missile operation and the nuclear reactor.
CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh takes a closer look at the initial strikes in Iran. He spoke with my colleague Isa Suarez earlier.
For more, I'm joined by Nick Payton-Walsh, who's here to lay it all out for us. Nick, let's start off, first of all, with what was hit and who they targeted.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, look, let's talk about the nuclear facilities first. Two of them clear here. Isfahan, it appears, according to the IAEA, they say not hit, but Natanz, where a lot of the key enrichment occurs. Some satellite images posted on social media show damage there. Iran says it's superficial. I think we'll learn more because that appears to be the preponderance of where Israeli strikes hit the nuclear infrastructure. And then Tehran too, where it appears multiple neighborhoods, some upscale, were hit as well. It appears targeting key parts of Iran's military hierarchy here. I mean, it's a devastating list, frankly, but it seems to grow every minute or so. I mean, just imagine waking up in the Iranian military and realizing that the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps is dead. The chief of the army staff is dead. A Khamenei aide in charge of the nuclear negotiations brief is dead. And the IRGC's Air Force commander killed, it seems, in a meeting of all of his other deputies too, where they were hit simultaneously. This list continues to grow.
This is a huge blow.
And this is the reason why I think we'll see maybe a muddled, a delayed, a non-proportional response from the Iranians, because they will have spent the best part of this morning trying to work out who survived and appointing successors, and probably the rather worrying task of working out how were they all located. It appears from some of the damage we've seen that apartment blocks were specifically targeted with pinpoint strikes, and that suggests people's phones were perhaps being followed. So a lot of anxiety in Tehran amongst the hierarchy, and that will definitely be impeding their response.
As we look at a regional map, and given what you've told me as well, I would have guessed this would have been months, potentially years in the making.
But it also happens in a region that's completely changed in the last year. And so remember,
speak to the risk then. Speak to the risk.
And reduced, I think, enormously because last summer, Israel in Lebanon launched those pager attacks and the military operations afterwards. Ruthless, brutal, but effective, dismantled Hezbollah to most degree. That was always the major worry for Israel, that if they launched an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, the second strike capability would be Iran's proxy here in Lebanon. That's gone. The Iran ally of Syria, right next to Israel. Regime change. Now, not exactly Israel's perfect neighbour, but not the Iranian ally that was there before. In Iraq, the pro-Iranian militias there, not the threat they necessarily have been in the past. And so Israel acting with greater freedom, certainly in this area, and also, too, in October, damaged a lot of Iran's air defences, making it vulnerable to what happened overnight.
So then, Nick, if you're in Tehran, you're weighing up the moment of how do we retaliate? Can we retaliate? How do we retaliate? And this is important, given, of course, the number of US troops across the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the distance that's been palpable between this Israeli operation and the Trump White House probably means that we're not going to see a full-throated Iranian bid to hit US military infrastructure around the region. There's a lot of it. Really, it's, I think, Iraq, Syria, maybe Jordan, they're more vulnerable as far as we know at this point. But I would be really surprised if Iran, weak as it is after last night, decides to broaden its list of enemies to bring in the United States, who are kind of not on the shelf now, very full-throated support for the success of the operation from President Trump, but he wants to see diplomacy come from it. So the response, I think, we'll see, you may see more attempts by drones, perhaps like this, the Shahid. You pre-program it, used across Ukraine to devastating effect if you can get enough of them in the sky to overwhelm air defences. But the suggestion that maybe 100 drones have been launched today hasn't really appeared to get through to Israel at all.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at a greatly diminished Iran, trying to work out potentially what it can do against an Israeli enemy with the F-16, the F-15 as well, technologically way more advanced, depleting their air defences on every given move. And as we saw at the start, an Iranian military command who are all over the place this morning.
Incredibly dangerous moment. Nick, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Abbas Milani is the director of the Iranian Studies program at Stanford University. He is also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and joins us now from Stanford, California. Abbas, it seems to most people who may have been listening that Israel's actions toward Iran were telegraphed, at least the potential for them. Since President Trump was publicly urging Israel to not interfere, to not attack, they did. Was the success of that attack a surprise given the signs in the lead up to it?
To me, it was a great deal of surprise because, as you said, there was very much an anticipation that the attack is imminent. The Iranians apparently expected it on Sunday. But it came a couple of days earlier, but they were utterly unprepared for it. And that's why almost 3/5 of their high control and command structure is destroyed. Some of the top leaders are destroyed. It is remarkable how, to me, unprepared they were, and they have paid a very high price for it.
When you look at the timing of all of this, what do you see? Why now?
Well, I think on the one hand, Mr. Netanyahu has been saying for some time that he thinks Iran is at its weakest point. In some ways, I think he's right. Iran is, at the moment, I think the weakest, is the most isolated. The economy is in shambles. There is strikes, truck drivers strikes. The regime is regionally isolated. As your program earlier indicated, it has lost almost all of its proxies. The people are profoundly disgruntled with the regime. And I think the regime had been, because of, I think, this weakness, openly talking in the weeks before the attacks about how they are capable of developing a bomb if push comes to shove. And I think Netanyahu used that narrative to then create the excuse for the attack. And I think they also were worried that maybe President Trump would make a bad deal that they would be unhappy with. And this was, in a way, an attempt to make sure that that deal doesn't happen.
They cut that off at the pass. Let's talk about the people of these two countries at the moment.